Hey everyone, it's Game Camilla here, back at you with another video, and today's video is all about E3, specifically for Nintendo. While E3 obviously is going to have a lot of video game companies there, going to have a lot of presentations, virtual this year, of course, Nintendo's is probably the most exciting, and it borders around a few things. Obviously, the Nintendo Switch has sold and continues to sell like hotcakes. In addition to that, software is being consumed at a high rate for the handheld console hybrid. But we know that Nintendo is working on a few really big titles. In addition to that, the Switch Pro rumors just will not stop. It seems everyone's convinced that a updated Switch model, a Super Switch or a Switch Pro, will be coming out sometime this year. And with all that on the plate, it looks like the 40-minute presentation Nintendo has for June 15th could be a real treat for everyone. In today's video, I'm going to go over a preview. I'm going to give a big preview for that Nintendo presentation with everything that we know so far, as well as I'm going to give some predictions for that presentation on what Nintendo might announce and show. So without any further ado, let's get to it. Let's get down to the preview and predictions for Nintendo for E3. First things first, let's start off with what we know. And we know that on June 15th, Nintendo said they're going to give a presentation on Nintendo software, exclusively on Nintendo software only. In addition to that, they're going to have a Treehouse Live. So knowing that, I can safely say that there's not going to be anything on E3 about the Super Switch or the Switch Pro or whatever they want to call it. It's not happening at E3 because Nintendo's pretty much said outright, without actually saying it, that they're going to show just software and software only, and they're not going to just show software for the Pro without actually showing or announcing the hardware first. I know that there was a rumor going around saying, hey, it was going to be announced ahead of time, but I think for Nintendo right now, Nintendo likes to do things on their own accord. Right now, they just want to announce software and focus on software. And I'm not going to bore you to death with predictions for when they're going to announce the Pro or that. I've actually kind of tried to ignore it on this channel. I've tried to ignore it a bit on Twitch, just because I feel like it's always in the news, it's always on Twitter, it's always everywhere, and everybody else just talks about it to death. The only thing I will say about the subject is if they announce it, it'll be later this year for the fall. If they don't announce it this year, then we might see it in the spring. Other than that, when it happens, it'll happen. Right now, it's software and software only. Now, as far as software goes, I think that Nintendo's going to try to strive with a balance here. They're going to have maybe 30% big titles to 10% smaller titles, somewhere around that margin. But a good chunk of it is going to focus on upcoming releases that we know. And what are some of those upcoming releases, some of those major releases? Well, for one, Mario Golf Super Rush comes out later this month. And I think that they will touch on that title because that is a big one for this month. Game Builder Garage actually comes out just before on the 11th, and I think they will actually touch on that as well because that's a neat, interesting title for them. And I'm sure there's going to be updates for that as well after the release. In addition to that, I believe they will talk about Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword comes out next month. And even though it's a re-release of an older title, it's still a big deal. It's Zelda. They've put some work into it. It's obvious Nintendo is really pushing it with Joy-Cons and some other stuff. Amiibos, of course. And that's going to be a big title for them. So all three of those are going to be touched upon during this presentation. In addition to that, you know that Nintendo has some big Pokemon games. It is the year for Pokemon, the 25th anniversary. Of course, Diamond and Pearl remakes come out later this year, as well as Arceus for the beginning of next year. And I do believe Nintendo's going to briefly touch upon those titles and mention some things I don't expect any of these games to have a really big, in-depth chunk of the presentation, but I feel they will all be touched upon at least in some shape or form during this presentation. Beyond those games, I feel like Nintendo is going to use a good chunk on some games that they've announced, but haven't really dived into. And I'm talking about Breath of the Wild 2. I think we're finally going to see Breath of the Wild 2, something more in-depth and chunky. I do believe that it's going to come out this year, and it's going to come out for the winter release, for the big holiday season. I believe this is going to be Nintendo's big holiday game. So I do believe that Nintendo will announce and go into good detail about the game, at least enough to get people really on notice for it. I do have a little bit of a long shot prediction when it comes to this game. I might be completely wrong, but I'm just going to shoot my shot here. I do believe the title is going to have multiplayer in some way, shape, or form. Most likely in co-op. And the reason why I say that is that we know it's a sequel to the original. Right now, from what we could tell from the little brief announcement way back when, is you saw Zelda, you saw Link. It just feels like if they want to do something a little bit different, but still keep that Zelda gameplay, the whole shebang, I feel like having a co-op element to it might really make this game stand out even more so than just being a plain sequel to the original. I know, it sounds crazy, but if there's anyone that can do it, Nintendo could definitely do it. I feel as well they're going to dive in and show some gameplay of some sort for Splatoon 3. It may not be deeply touched upon, but I feel like Nintendo knows how much people love Splatoon. Splatoon 2, of course, did really well on the Switch. But Splatoon 3, the hype is real. I remember when they were announcing that they were working on it, and Twitter exploded. So I feel like they might touch upon that during this presentation. Just again, I don't feel like they're going to go really crazy in details for that. I think that's something always for a later date, but I think they will at least show something a little bit more than what they have shown so far, which is very little. Now, again, all those titles that I've talked about so far are titles that we know Nintendo is coming out with, and Nintendo is working on, that they're deep in development for. It's either going to come out soon or within the next year, most likely. But now we really get into the predictions, the tinfoil hat time. I think Nintendo will mention or at least talk about during the presentation. So these, they may happen, and of course they may not. I'm pretty sure about everything I've mentioned so far. This, can be I mean, well, let's just get to it. First of all, I think that Nintendo will at least mention something of Metroid 4. We know Nintendo announced it forever ago. I feel like now would be a good time, or maybe this is more hopeful, wistful thinking, but now would be a good time for Nintendo to come out with it and say, hey, Metroid Prime 4, 2022. That would be great. If I'm right about Breath of the Wild 2 being the big holiday release for this year, Metroid 4 would definitely be a huge release for the holiday season next year. In addition to that, I feel like Nintendo will make some announcements about games we don't already know about, but there are not going to be too many of these. I mean, to be fair, everything I've talked about so far would take up a good chunk of the presentation, though I feel like Nintendo will touch on some smaller titles. So with all that, I just don't feel like Nintendo is going to have a lot of time left in 40 minutes to talk about too many surprise announcement releases. I do feel like Ubisoft is going to announce Rabbids 2, and I don't think it may happen during the presentation, but I'll just include it right here. But Mario plus Rabbids did really well for Ubisoft, and Ubisoft's a big supporter of the Nintendo Switch. And I wouldn't be surprised if they come out with a sequel game for the Switch. But it remains to be seen if they announce it during this presentation or it'll be more of a Ubisoft thing. They might touch on it briefly, but I feel like this E3 would be a good time to announce for it. Not only that, as a fall game, that would be a huge title without actually being a Nintendo first party per se for the system. And I know I haven't really touched upon third-party games for this, besides Ubisoft of course, but I feel like Capcom will probably have something during this presentation as well in terms of Monster Hunter Rise, which has been a monster hit for the system, as well as Monster Hunter Stories 2 will be coming out, so you might see a little bit more of that. Nothing too big, nothing too major. I feel like a lot of that stuff's going to be saved for presentations or announcements from the third-party companies themselves instead of during this Nintendo presentation. I also feel like Nintendo is going to at least announce a little bit more Zelda stuff, kind of double back to the Breath of the Wild 2 and Skyward Sword. I just feel like Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess AC would be a great double combo pack. Wishful thinking, but I feel like Nintendo is going to announce it at some point, and it would be a great time to announce it during the presentation for it. Just to mention, like, hey, we have this in the work, and it's coming out later this year, or something like that. It's wishful thinking. It's probably not going to happen, but I want it to happen. I'm going to put it in the video here. I want it to happen. Please. Wind Waker HD on the Switch. And there you go. That is my preview and predictions for Nintendo's presentation that they're going to have on the 15th. Hopefully it's good. Hopefully it delivers. I'm curious though, what are your predictions? What are your thoughts about the upcoming E3? Maybe not even just Nintendo, but E3 in general. I want to know down in the comments down below, what are your predictions? What are your guesses of what will be talked about, what will be announced for E3? If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. I do a bunch of videos each and every week. I do a lot of Nintendo stuff, not a Nintendo Switch, as well as tips and tricks and other videos about video games. And if all that sounds exciting to you, then you definitely want to consider subscribing. I also want to make a huge shout out to everyone who's been watching my videos, as well as subscribing. We're almost at 500 subscribers, guys. I'm blown away. You guys are amazing. Thank you for the support. But before we go, you know what? I think I'm going to make one more prediction for Nintendo for E3. Here we go. Here we go. This is the long shot. We're announcing another Mario game. That's it. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you next time.